please take over? Cinda?
Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Maybe it's because I'm in Harvard, Idaho, and I have satellite internet. I'm not certain of the reason. But anyhow, so can we advance the slides now?
You bet.
Okay, that's me on the
There's
left,
Melissa.
Okay, one more, and then one more. So the first, that's me, that's one of my sheep in the upper corner there. Okay, I'd like to start out with human resources. The human resources that I have that I can bring, that I brought to this venture. And I'm not going to read every one to you, but the first one I think is the most important for any venture, passion for the work. In my life, my experience, and in with every farmer I know, success seems to be in direct proportion to the passion. You have to love it. You've got to find the thing that you love. This is not just a job, because nobody's going to become a billionaire farming. That's not why we do it. So I brought tons of passion, tons of energy, the willingness to learn. You guys are all taking this class. You're off to a great start. And also the willingness to take risks. Certainly in raising livestock, there are financial risks, of course, physical risks. You know, what if I get hurt? I'm doing this by myself. Am I willing to live with that? How about the emotional risks? What if I fail? How's that going to feel? What if an animal dies? Which, of course, it's sad but true. It happens. We make mistakes. Animals die. Animals die regardless of us sometimes. Can you deal with that? There are definitely people who are just not equipped to deal with it. That's something that I had to work through, and that's not been an issue for me. I have basically good marketing skills, and I knew early on that I wanted to market with a website. That's my primary marketing tool, and I knew I had the ability to learn how to do that. So however you think about how you're going to market, it needs to be something you're comfortable with. I think that's the takeaway from that. In terms of my liabilities, this is a one-person operation. I don't really see it as a liability. This is how I love doing it, but I have to be incredibly efficient. I have to make every single bit of labor count, every hour of energy count. That's a challenge, and that colors every single decision I make, actually. And the last limitation I list here is hire an accountant, because in analyzing myself, my skills, my strengths and weaknesses, I hate dealing with numbers. Now, I'll keep the books, I'll keep records, but I do not want to do my taxes. That's a very personal choice, and I'm so happy I made that years and years and years ago, made that decision. The accountant has offered me tremendous amounts of advice, and I don't have to keep up on the constantly changing tax laws. It feels great to just give it all to her. Okay, Cinda, next slide. Next, resources that Cinda talked about, and I'm going to bring up too, are financial. Now, my goal from the time I was 4 years old was to be a farmer, live on a farm, and once I got old enough to understand that we have to earn a living, I wanted it to be my full-time income. So when I started studying, probably 25 years ago, but from the beginning, that was the goal. And I knew I was going to need to do this, so for the first 10 years, about the first 10 years, I worked part-time. Now, the good thing is I usually worked at home and was self-employed, so my hours could be flexible, which was a huge help for me. I had rented rural properties for quite a long time. I started raising animals on a rented 20-acre, what I call practice farm, in '92. It was a huge learning experience for me. It was wonderful. I didn't really invest a lot of money. I basically did the work and learned about fencing, livestock management, rotational grazing, pasture management. All of the basics I learned on this small practice farm. Then, by '98, I was ready to purchase a farm, and I purchased the 65-acre farm that I'm on now and hit the ground running. I knew what I wanted to do, and I had the skills to start doing it right away. My financial resources were some savings and a small inheritance. That's how I got it going. I do have a mortgage. I wish I didn't. If you can possibly get away with not having a mortgage, I urge you to go for it. I looked, and I think this is important to note, I looked at 53 properties before I bought this place over a 2-year period. This was number 53. I had been doing it long enough that I had a pretty long list of criteria. I knew what I was looking for, and I just wasn't finding it, so I just kept looking and looking and looking. But the wonderful thing about that experience was, I walked 53 properties, went out, walked through the house, walked the land, and out of those there were probably 15 or so that I was very seriously thinking about buying, and each one had its own issue. Every place has issues. So it was a wonderful opportunity to learn even more. Like, okay, this place is great, except it's going to need a new well. What's entailed with that? Call a well driller, call the county. How much will it cost? Figure out the whole thing about how wells are drilled, how it works, what it would cost me. Okay, then maybe the other place needed a septic system. Well, actually, this place needed a septic system. So research all of that. So by the time I finally got to this final number 53 property, I had a huge, huge backlog of knowledge about what I was looking for. So I urge anybody to spend the time. If you haven't bought property yet, spend time. Go look. Look at properties. Talk to people. Okay, Cinda, next slide. The next resource I want to talk about is natural resource, and specifically I'm referring to the land. In my long list of criteria, I knew I was going to raise grazing animals, I wanted pastures, and I definitely wanted trees, because certainly out here in the Palouse where it's quite windy, trees mediate the weather in the winter and in the summer, provide shelter for the animals, because I did not want to keep them in a barn. My animals live out in the woods, 10 months, woods and pastures 10 months out of the year. They put their manure where I want it, and I believe it's healthier for them, and it forces them to get exercise. So I knew I wanted trees for the animals and also for my own firewood, of course. And I ended up finding a place that was half pastures and half logged over evergreen woods. Those are two shots. The shot on the bottom is the woods. That's probably, can't tell if it's fall or early spring. There's not much snow on the ground. Anyhow, that's where the animals spend their winters. Now, a limitation to this property, I was all excited. Yes, it had these two things that I wanted, but this is life. There's two sides of every coin. The challenges were the pastures. Well, I called them pastures, but in reality what they were is conventionally farmed hay fields for the past 40 years. They'd had nitrogen and sulfur applied year after year after year. That's it, nothing else. Nitrogen and sulfur, nitrogen and sulfur. That's what the hay farmers around here apply. That's all they do. So, okay, I knew I would need to recover, the land would need to recover from that, and I had already decided I was going to do rotational grazing. But frankly, I partially saw that as an asset, because although it had been farmed chemically, chemical fertilizers, chemical herbicides, it was virtually weed-free. So I was off to a good start. It's not like a lot of the places I looked at were growing bumper crops of knapweed. That's a particularly nasty weed in northern Idaho. And other thistles, terrible, terrible weeds. So there were pluses and minuses to it having been farmed chemically. The logged over woods, also pluses and minuses, because it opened up this very dense forest for me to turn it into woodland pastures, which is exactly what I've done in the last 15 years of grazing. Every single summer, I think a good way to put this is I've so dramatically improved all of the pastures. And I think a good way to say this is, my first year, my market lambs, by fall, weighed about 75 pounds. After 5 years, my market lambs weighed close to 100 pounds. And nothing else had changed. I wasn't feeding them any differently. I was just rotating them through the pastures. So that was thrilling, you know, a thrilling example of the power of rotational grazing. And that's also, well, anyhow, so pluses, minuses on the land. I got something close, but of course it had an issue with it. Send in next slide. The next major natural resource that everyone is concerned about if you're raising animals and or if you're growing crops is water. We've got to have water one way or another. Now on my long list of criteria, I wanted everything. I wanted multiple year-round creeks, several ponds, a well that gave at least 20 gallons per minute because that's what I was used to where I came from, which is the Sandpoint area north of Coeur d'Alene. This property, at first I was disappointed. It turned out to be just fine. One seasonal creek, one seasonal pond, a year-round pond, which I use for backup emergencies, and a very, by many standards, low-producing well, 2 gallons per minute, meaning it refills at a rate of 2 gallons per minute, or 120 gallons will flow into that pipe in an hour. However, as part of my research, I talked to neighbors about the well, I talked to the former owners about the well, and was convinced that it was reliable year-round water. It doesn't dry up at the end of summer, and it's excellent water. I had the water tested, it tastes wonderful, and everybody loves it. And this is an example of working with what you have and being open enough to go with the flow. You see that word runway there. The sheep are on what I call the runway. This property happened to have on it a road that meanders back to the back of the property, goes basically right down the center. And I had been researching rotational grazing and how to design paddocks, and as I walked out on this property, I just saw it. Oh, I could do this here. Make all these pastures, have each one open onto the runway, have the animals walk out of the pasture, down the runway, up to the barn, where there is a frost-free spigot and 2 70-gallon water tanks, drink their water, eat their minerals, and then walk back to the pasture to graze, continue grazing. And suddenly I realized it was a reality. I could make what I had been reading about in books actually work. So that's what we've been doing for the 15 years that I've been on this farm, and it has worked just marvelously. And the added benefit, of course, is the animals get all this exercise like animals do in the natural world. You know, in the natural world, very few animals have a stock pond 50 feet from where they sleep. I'm convinced that's a tremendous part of why these animals have stayed so healthy. It helps wear down their hooves, so hoof trimming chores are not so serious. It's just been win-win. Next slide.